Welcome to my channel. My name is Sophia Harper, and I never thought I would be telling this story out loud, but if you are listening right now, it means the worst phone call of my life already happened, and I survived it. I was 32, a single mother working rotating shifts as a pediatric respiratory therapist, and my son Eli was 4 when the daycare called Child Protective Services on me. And I want you to understand something before we go any further. I was not late, I was not careless, I was not cruel. I was tired, and I was doing everything I could to keep a small boy safe in a world that does not slow down for women like me. That morning started the way so many of them did, with a dark kitchen and a flickering light and coffee that tasted burnt because I reheated it twice while packing Eli lunch. He liked apple slices and peanut butter and the blue dinosaur container that never quite snapped shut. I tied his shoes while he told me about a dream where our car could fly, and I kissed the cowlick on the back of his head and told him maybe someday. We drove through fog that sat low over the road, and the radio murmured about traffic, and nothing felt dangerous, nothing felt wrong. The daycare was a beige building with cheerful murals painted too bright to be comforting and a sign that said Safe Beginnings Learning Center. I signed him in with the pen that never worked and handed him to Ms. Karen, who did not smile with her eyes and told me he looked tired today, and I said we both were. And I went to work thinking about ventilators and tiny lungs and alarms that do not care if you slept later. That afternoon my phone vibrated in my pocket while I was charting, and the number was unfamiliar, and when I answered, a calm voice said, "This is Child Protective Services, and we need to speak with you immediately about your son." And the room tilted the way it does when oxygen drops and your body knows before your brain does. I asked if he was hurt, and the voice said he is safe, but we have concerns, and my hands went cold. I do not remember the drive. I remember the steering wheel under my palms and the red lights that felt like accusations, and the way the daycare parking lot looked exactly the same as it always had, as if nothing had changed inside. I walked in, and Ms. Karen would not meet my eyes, and the director, a woman named Linda with perfect hair, told me there had been reports of neglect and unsafe conditions, and my mouth opened, but nothing came out because neglect is a word that sticks to your skin. I asked who reported it, and she said mandated reporters, and I asked what unsafe conditions, and she said chronic lateness, inadequate clothing, and emotional distress. And I laughed once, a short broken sound, because Eli had a jacket and boots and gloves, and he cried when I left because he was 4, not because he was neglected. And then a woman with a badge asked me to sit and told me we would go to my home to do a safety check, and I asked where my son was, and she said he would remain here until we finished. And that was when something in me went quiet, the way it does before a storm. I nodded because arguing never helps when power has already decided you are wrong. My apartment was small, but clean. Toys lined up, books on the couch, a mattress on the floor because Eli liked to roll, and the woman with the badge took notes and opened cabinets and asked about food and sleep and discipline, and I answered every question the way I answer doctors in the ICU: direct, factual, no emotion, because emotion gets you labeled unstable. When we returned, Eli ran to me and buried his face in my coat and whispered, "Are we in trouble, Mommy?" And I said, "No, baby, we are just tired." And he believed me because he always had. The caseworker told me there would be an investigation and that I should expect follow-up, and she handed me a pamphlet and left me standing there with my son and the echo of a word: neglect. That night, after Eli fell asleep clutching his stuffed turtle, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at my hands and replayed every drop-off, every pickup, every comment, every look from Ms. Karen, the way she once told me maybe I should find a job with better hours, and the time she wrote late again on the sign-in sheet even though I was 3 minutes early, and the day she sighed when Eli cried too hard at nap time, and something clicked, not loud, not dramatic, just a small, precise realization that this was not about safety, this was about control. And I did what I always do when something does not make sense. I documented. I pulled bank statements and pediatrician records, vaccination logs, attendance sheets, text messages, emails, photos of our fridge, our pantry, his clothes, his shoes, his bed. I requested my personnel file from work showing my shifts and overtime. I asked neighbors to write statements about seeing us every day. I emailed the daycare asking for the incident report, and they replied with a paragraph full of generalities and no dates, and I printed it and highlighted every empty space, because empty spaces matter. 2 days later, CPS called to schedule interviews, and I agreed, and the caseworker asked why Eli Sometimes cried at drop-off, and I said because he is 4 and sensitive, and because separation is hard, and she asked why he once came without gloves, and I said because gloves get lost, and it was 60 degrees, and she asked why I worked nights. And I said because hospitals do not close and bills do not wait, and when she left I felt wrung out, but steady, because facts were on my side, or so I thought. Then the daycare sent a notice terminating our enrollment effective immediately, citing policy violations and safety concerns, and I sat on the floor and laughed again, that same broken sound, because losing childcare when you are a single mother is not inconvenience, it is disaster. I called my sister and my friend and my supervisor and patched together shifts and favors and late nights while the investigation crawled forward, and Eli asked why he could not see his friends, and I told him sometimes grown-ups make mistakes and we have to be patient. And at night when the apartment was quiet, I reread the CPS pamphlet and circled words like risk assessment and substantiation and timelines, and I learned that once a report exists it follows you like a shadow even if it is unfounded, and that was when I decided I would not let this be a shadow. I would make it a record with light on it. I requested the daycare licensing history and found 3 prior complaints, 1F or staff yelling, 1 for ratios, 1 for falsified logs. I requested camera footage and was told it had been overwritten. I requested Eli daily reports and found gaps and identical phrases copy-pasted across days. I emailed Linda again asking for specifics, and she replied with a warning tone about legal counsel, and that was when I called a lawyer, not because I wanted to sue, but because I wanted to breathe, and he listened and said something simple: you are being targeted, and we will prove it. And the investigation continued, interviews, forms, waiting, and one afternoon the caseworker called to say the daycare claimed Eli arrived hungry and withdrawn, and I said that was false, and I had photos, timestamps, breakfast logs, and she said we will note your response, and the calmness in her voice scared me more than anger, because calmness means process, and process can grind you down slowly. And through all of it Eli kept being 4. He built towers, he sang songs, he asked if turtles dream, and one night he asked if the bad lady would take him away, and I held him and said no, and meant it with every document, every email, every sleepless hour, because this story is not about a bad day, it is about what happens when a system meets a woman who refuses to disappear. And we are only at the beginning, even if it does not sound like it right now, because the call that came next would change everything, and it would not come from CPS or the daycare, but from a place I never expected, and when it did I would understand why this had happened at all, and why some people underestimate what a quiet mother can do when you threaten her child. I kept moving because stopping felt dangerous, and every morning after that call I woke up before my alarm and lay there listening to Eli breathe, counting the rise and fall of his chest the way I do at work when a child is connected to a machine and you are waiting for numbers to tell you what your eyes already know, that they are still here. I took him to a temporary sitter, a woman named Rosa, who lived 2 floors down and smelled like cinnamon and safety, and while she watched him I went back to the hospital and did my job with a focus that scared my coworkers, because when you have a child and someone threatens to take him away you learn how to become very, very precise. The caseworker scheduled a second visit, this time with her supervisor, and they sat at my small kitchen table while Eli colored dinosaurs on the floor, and they asked again about my schedule, and again about food, and again about emotional well-being, and I answered, and then I slid a folder across the table without a word. Inside were printouts, photos, logs, and a simple timeline, and I watched their eyes change, not dramatically, just a small recalibration, like when a monitor alarm stops screaming, because the problem was never real. The supervisor nodded and said thank you for being prepared, and I said this is my child, and after they left I let my hands shake, because I had held them still long enough. The daycare, however, did not stop. Linda emailed saying they stood by their report and that my defensiveness was concerning, and I printed that email and added it to the folder, because words reveal more than people think. The lawyer asked me to write everything down, every interaction, every tone, every delay, and as I did patterns emerged: late fees that were selectively enforced, notes about behavior that did not match, videos from my phone dates that overlapped, staff shortages, and then one afternoon Rosa knocked on my door holding her phone and said you should hear this, and played a voicemail from another parent, a whisper of fear about ratios and locked doors, and a director who told them to keep quiet. If they wanted their spot, I asked permission to share it, and she nodded, and something hardened in me, not anger, but resolve. CPS called again to say the daycare had added concerns, claiming Eli had spoken about being alone at night, and I laughed again, that same sound, and asked to see the transcript, and when it arrived it was vague, no quotes, no dates, just impressions, and that was when my lawyer requested the daycare incident logs under state regulations, and they delayed and delayed until a deadline forced their hand, and the logs arrived incomplete, altered times, missing signatures, identical handwriting across multiple staff names, and my lawyer smiled without smiling and said this is not good for them. The caseworker came to observe Eli with Rosa and watched him build a tower and narrate a story about a turtle who protects his egg, and she wrote notes and asked him who makes dinner, and he said Mommy does, and she asked who reads stories, and he said Mommy, and she asked if he feels safe, and he said yes, and that should have been enough, but systems do not move on enough, they move on procedure, and meanwhile the daycare filed a formal appeal against my complaint about termination, and I attended a hearing in a room with bad chairs and fluorescent lights, and Linda spoke in a calm, practiced tone about safety culture, and I spoke once and handed over documents, and the board members asked questions, and when Linda could not answer specifics, the room shifted quietly like sand under water. After the hearing, a woman approached me in the hallway, a former teacher who said she had been pushed out for raising concerns, and she emailed me that night a long message with dates and names and a sentence that made my breath catch. She wrote they were told to flag certain families as high risk, and single mothers with night shifts were on the list. I forwarded it to my lawyer and to CPS and to licensing, and then I sat with Eli on the couch and let him fall asleep on my shoulder, because courage costs energy and children take what you have left. The CPS supervisor called to say the report was leaning unfounded pending final review, and I thanked her, and then she said something unexpected. She said off the record, I wish more parents documented like you, and I said off the record, I wish fewer had to. 2 days later, licensing inspectors showed up at the daycare unannounced, and parents texted each other in a chain of fear and hope, and I received a message from a number I did not recognize saying thank you for speaking up, and I realized this was bigger than us, not louder but wider. Linda sent another email warning me about defamation, and I forwarded it to my lawyer, who replied with one line, stop contacting my client, and then silence from the daycare, which is never a good sign for the people who think silence protects them. CPS closed the case unfounded and sent a letter, and I held it like a passport and cried into it quietly, because relief can feel like grief leaving the body all at once. But the story did not end there, because investigations have momentum and licensing does not like patterns, and the former teacher agreed to speak and Rosa agreed to testify, and other parents came forward, and the beige building with the cheerful murals began to crack, not visibly, not yet, but in files and reports and meetings. And Eli started at a new center, smaller, kinder, staffed by women who smiled with their eyes, and when he cried they knelt, and when I picked him up they told me about his day with details, and I realized how much I had been holding my breath before one evening my lawyer called and said licensing found multiple violations, falsified logs, improper ratios, retaliation against families, and a failure to preserve footage, and they were recommending suspension pending revocation, and I sat down because my legs gave out, not from victory but from the weight of knowing how close we had come to something irreversible. And later that night Eli asked if the bad place was gone, and I said it was changing, and he said okay, and went back to drawing, and that is how children are, they accept safety and move on while adults circle the memory. And I thought we were done, but a letter arrived from the daycare attorney proposing a settlement with conditions, silence, money, and non-disclosure, and my lawyer asked what I wanted, and I looked at Eli and said I want the truth on record, and we declined. And the next week the state posted the notice publicly, and parents pulled their kids, and the building emptied, and Linda resigned, and the director license was suspended, and CPS sent a final note thanking me for cooperation, and I put all the papers in a box and labeled it, because closure needs a container, and yet even then there was more, because accountability has a way of rippling outward. And the call that came next was from the hospital. Not about work, but about a board position opening related to community child safety, and I listened and thought about how a phone call that tried to break us had instead opened a door, and I said yes, and the story kept moving forward without pausing, because it never Really pauses, it just changes direction. The weeks that followed did not feel like victory, they felt like walking through a house after a fire where everything still smells like smoke, and even the safe rooms make you flinch when the floor creaks. I kept routines because routines tell a child the world is still predictable. Breakfast at the same time, shoes by the door, stories before bed, and every night after Eli slept I sat at the table and wrote notes for the board role I had accepted, because I understood now that silence helps the wrong people and process can protect the right ones if someone is willing to stay inside it long enough. The hospital days blurred into each other, alarms, hands, gloves, breath, and then evenings at the new center where teachers knelt to Eli level and asked about his drawings and told me small true things about his day, and each time I felt a muscle in my chest unclench a little. I began attending meetings about child safety, reporting about how mandated reporting can be weaponized and how documentation can be a shield, and when I spoke, I did not raise my voice. I told the story without decoration, without names, without anger, and people leaned in because calm truth is louder than outrage. A reporter reached out asking for comment, and my lawyer advised caution, and I said I would speak only if it served families and not headlines, and she agreed to wait. And then the daycare attorney tried again, offering money and a statement about mutual misunderstandings, and I declined again because mutual is a word that blurs harm, and I wanted clarity, not comfort. Rosa brought me soup one night and said parents were still thanking me in the hallway, and I hugged her and felt how much community forms when fear breaks open. And the licensing decision came down, final revocation, public record, and I printed it and placed it in the box with the rest, not as a trophy, but as a map of where we had been and how we got out. Eli asked fewer questions about the bad place and more about his turtle drawings, and one afternoon he said, "Mommy, I feel safe here," and that sentence did more for me than any letter ever could. The board work expanded, and I learned about gaps in training and resources, and I helped write a proposal for parent access to incident logs and clearer appeal paths, and it passed quietly because good policy does not need applause. My sister asked why I looked lighter, and I told her the truth, that carrying fear is heavy and setting it down leaves marks on the floor, but you can still walk. The CPS supervisor emailed months later to say they had updated internal guidance about documentation standards and caregiver schedules, and I read it twice and smiled, because change rarely announces itself, it just shows up in better paperwork and fewer late-night calls. Then a mother named Jen contacted me through a mutual friend. Her son had been flagged at another center for similar reasons, and she asked what to do, and I told her to breathe and write everything down and ask for specifics and bring light. And later, she texted me a photo of a closed case letter, and I cried again, not because of the past, but because of the future opening. Inch by inch, Eli started kindergarten, and on the first day, he ran ahead and turned back and waved, and I stood there watching his backpack bounce and thought about how close someone came to defining his story before he had words for it, and how systems are built by people and people can change them if they are stubborn enough. The hospital offered me a schedule with more predictability, and I accepted, because survival mode should not be permanent. And nights grew quieter, and the apartment felt less like a bunker and more like a home. I finally listened to the voicemails I had saved during the investigation, the tight voices, the assumptions, the pauses, and I deleted them one by one, because memory does not need evidence once it has taught you what you needed to learn. The reporter came back months later with a different angle about policy changes and parent empowerment, and I agreed and spoke carefully and did not name the center and did not dramatize, and when it aired, strangers wrote to say they felt seen, and that was enough. One evening I found Eli reenacting school with his toys. The turtle was the teacher, and the dinosaur raised its hand, and the turtle said, "We take care of each other here," and I laughed softly and sat on the floor and realized children absorb values even when you think they are not listening. Especially then, I kept serving on the board and kept my job and kept my child and kept my breath, and sometimes I would still wake early with my heart racing, and then I would hear Eli snore, and the room would settle, because safety is not the absence of fear, it is the presence of proof, and I had proof everywhere in the quiet ways things worked now, and the story kept moving forward without fanfare, because that is how healing often goes unnoticed until you look back and realize how far you have walked from the place where your hands first went cold and the phone first rang, and someone tried to tell you who you were, and you decided to write your own record instead. Time did not snap back into place after everything settled. It stretched and softened like fabric worn in by use, and I learned that peace is not loud. It is steady. Mornings where no one is watching the clock like a threat, and evenings where the door closes without fear. I stayed on the board, and the work deepened. Training modules rewritten, clearer language for parents and providers, better oversight for mandated reporting. And when people asked why I cared so much, I said, because systems touch children before they understand words, and adults must be careful with their power. Eli grew taller, his shoes wore down at the heels, his questions shifted from why to how, and sometimes to remember when, and we did remember together without making it a monument. We remembered in the way you remember storms after the ground has dried, as information, not identity. I took him camping for the first time, and he slept curled in a sleeping bag listening to wind through trees, and said, "Mommy, the forest is loud but not scary," and I smiled, because that sentence meant he understood the difference. The hospital gave me a leadership role, mentoring new therapists, and I taught them the same thing: document without drama, speak plainly, listen closely, and protect the smallest patient in the room even when the room disagrees. Letters still arrive, sometimes emails from parents who heard the story through quiet channels, and I answered when I could and said, "You are not wrong to ask for details, and you are not dramatic to want clarity." And each time I sent that message, I felt the echo of the woman I had been at the kitchen table, shaking and choosing to write instead of disappear. One afternoon, the former daycare building reopened under new ownership, new staff, new murals, less bright, more honest, and I drove past it without stopping and felt nothing, which surprised me because I thought I would feel something. But closure does not always announce itself. Sometimes it just leaves the room. Eli brought home a picture from school of a turtle and a dinosaur holding hands under a sun, and he wrote "safe" at the top, and I pinned it to the fridge and breathed, because children translate the world into symbols, and this was a good one. The board adopted a new policy requiring transparency with families and a clear appeal process, and when it passed there was no applause, just nods and movement on to the next item, and that felt right, because protection should be boring, predictable, and reliable. Months later, the reporter sent a link to a piece about policy changes statewide, and my name was not mentioned, and that felt right too, because stories are tools, not trophies. I kept a box of documents in the closet, and one day I realized I had not opened it in a long time, so I took it out and flipped through and felt gratitude, not for the pain, but for the map it created of how to move when fear tries to corner you. I shredded what could be shredded and kept what mattered and put it back, because history should be accessible but not heavy. Eli lost his first tooth and left it under his pillow, and the next morning he asked if the turtle fairy came, and I said maybe, and he laughed and ran to school, and I stood in the doorway and let the sunlight warm my face and thought about how many doors had closed and opened since that first call, and how none of them defined us alone. It was the choices between them that did. The board role ended after a term, and I stepped back, knowing when to leave is part of doing the work, and I continued quietly, advising when asked and returning to my life with my child, which had always been the point. My sister said, "You seem different," and I said yes, and she asked how, and I said, "I trust myself now," and that felt like the truest summary possible. Eli asked one night if the bad ladies were gone, and I said the bad choices were addressed and the good choices stayed, and he nodded satisfied and fell asleep holding his turtle, and I watched him and knew that safety is something you build again and again, not a place you reach and stop. And when fear whispered, I answered with routine and proof and love, and it worked. If you are listening to this now, I want you to know why I am telling it. I am Sophia Harper, and this is not a story about winning. It is a story about refusing to be erased. When someone uses a system to silence you, write louder with facts. When someone tells you to sit down, stand in place and hold your ground. When someone threatens your child, do not wait for permission to protect them. If this story helped you breathe even a little, then it did its job. Welcome to my channel, where I tell the stories that systems try to bury and where quiet mothers do not disappear. If you are here, subscribe, stay with me, share this with someone who needs it, and remember, safety grows where truth is allowed to stay.